Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-part series, which is brought to you with support from the Global Environmental Justice Documentary Film Collection, my guests and I will be discussing the benefits and techniques behind using documentary films as instruction and research tools. Joining me are Becky Overmeyer Velasquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. We'll be using the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries collection as a jumping-off point and centerpiece for our discussions, and earning a highly recommended rating in Choice Reviews. The GEJ Film Collection currently contains 48 documentary films and teacher's guides focus on environmental justice themes relating, for now, to Asia and North America. The collection got its start in 2019 at Whittier College when Gary, Jake, and Becky began collaborating on the initial curation of film titles and the design of the teacher's guides. Further curation and teacher guide authorship were provided by a growing list of faculty from Whittier and other institutions, and funding from the Henry Luce Foundation supported the growth and distribution of the platform. The collection is aimed at the undergraduate level, but the films are also suitable for secondary and postgraduate use. Importantly for this series, however, is the invaluable insight we get from Jake and Becky into the ways in which teaching faculty use documentary films and GEJ's custom teacher's guides as highly effective pedagogical tools. We'll learn about how faculty help curate the collection, write the guides, and how documentaries are most effectively incorporated into instruction. In this third episode of our 4-part series, we dive into the more pedagogical aspects of using documentary films in a class setting. I ask our guests what they think of documentary films as instructional sources, how they've incorporated them into their own instruction, and how they enable students to connect with environmental issues on both a global and personal level. I'd like to get into, the process of instruction using documentaries, and Becky, I think you talked a little bit about this in episode 2. But in what ways are documentary films particularly good at instructional sources? In what ways can they uniquely engage students in the research?
Yeah, they're just fantastic. So I've been using them since I was a graduate student teaching, way back a million years ago. I'm a sociologist, so it's important for my students to understand contemporary events from the perspective of the people who experience them. And, in some courses, that means, they go out and they do interviews and they do observations, and then they collect that data and they write that up. And that's fantastic because they learn so much more by applying, that's praxis, right? They apply what they're learning in the classroom to a real world situation, and they analyze that using the concepts they've learned in class. And it makes learning so much more effective because they really understand the concepts, they understand the issues. But in a lot of courses I teach, especially global focused courses, you can't have students go off and do that kind of firsthand data collection and ethnographies. And so the films, really good documentary films that provide, really, really helpful context that really situate the case in a larger issue and in a larger geographical and temporal context. Stand in really for the firsthand knowledge that students might get in a research course, for example. So they're essential for applying it. They're really an essential part of praxis, which is applying what you're learning in the course to an understanding and an analysis of a real world case, to see that, for students to really understand that what we're learning about in the classroom doesn't stay in the classroom. It's relevant. It's relevant in the sense that it helps you make sense of the world and what's going on in the world. And in my case, right, to do something about it, to understand it better, to make a positive change. And so I've always thought that documentary films, and documentary filmmakers operate in many cases from that very perspective, right? That understanding that the reason I'm going off and doing these films is precisely because I want something to change. So that would be my perspective.
Okay, excellent.
And I'll just add to that from a filmmaker's point of view, this is gold. This is wonderful. This is the best thing that could possibly happen to your film, is that it goes into a classroom where people are talking about the larger context for it, talking about the details on it, and then viewing a portion of the film and then sharing their thoughts afterwards. I mean, it's the kind of careful consideration that you rarely get when something just pops up on television, you watch it, and then it goes on to a game show. You can be so easily distracted by the medium that we love. To find the material so carefully considered is just, it's divine.
Yeah. And then Jake, you're in the humanities, right? So, how does that work for you?
Well, in almost precisely the exact same way that Becky described.
Right.
That contextual specificity that is a sort of promoted or allowed for or engaged in the context of the viewing the documentaries, these things can be have a profound impact in terms of decentering a student from their own location, entering into the life worlds of other people, hearing their voices, and stepping back out and thinking about what was that and how might I act and think and do in the world. I mean, that's sort of a crucial question that both of our disciplines, sociology and religious studies, asks. And that decentering moment is there's just so much potentiality in that. And it's analogous in some ways to what happens when students study abroad. They're able to get into another experience radically different from perhaps their own life story, but maybe resonant with it and see things in a new way. And that's the real power of the documentary films in many cases, that they do some of that work. They help us do that work that we try to do with students and this kind of critical, analytical, praxis-oriented way that Becky was talking about.
Mm-hmm. So, Becky, I'd like to go back to you and just kind of, if you can provide like a specific example of how you've incorporated a particular film in your instruction.
Yeah. So two different courses. In one course, I been teaching a social movements course, which focuses on Indigenous peoples' movements, social movements, political movements for change in different parts of the world. And so I have relied on a couple of times now. I used what's called it's a compilation kind of different cases called Standing on Sacred Ground. This one moves from Papua New Guinea to the tar sands in Alberta and really looks at the threats that industrialization and in these cases mining and for metals, but also for oil and natural gas, the ways in which these industrial operations necessarily impact Native Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, but in a way that really helps the students see that goes beyond. Well, yes, there's pollution. Yes, there's air pollution. There's soil degradation. There's water pollution. All the things. But what's good about this documentary is that it helps the students see that these industrial takings of and incursions on Indigenous people's land and territory is an existential threats in ways that I think it's hard for urbanized students to understand that when you take away the sources of food and water and also the landscapes that are inherent in the stories about your own identity as a people, right? That is devastating. And I think if you don't have without that film, to have the people in these different places talk about what that means, like what it means to lose the ability to fish and to lose the ability to be actually in these sacred spaces because you can't go there anymore. They've been dug up. It's visceral, I think, in a way that is just I can't explain it in a classroom. You can't read about that. You have to see it and hear it from people's own perspectives, and it's not perfect. It's not like it's not completely without mediation in the film, but it's as close as they're going to get at this point. It seems to me with the in the classroom setting. So I think I've seen this, and I've seen the way that it changes the conversations then in the classroom so that they begin to understand in a much deeper way what's really at stake in these in environmental destruction, right? That otherwise we wouldn't be able to have that conversation. So that
Yep.
one film, I would say that's one really, for me, a very helpful example.
Great. Thank you. And then Jake, how about you?
Yeah, I've used the films in a variety of ways, and I think a good example to highlight for our this discussion now is I took a look at the GEJ project as a whole and said, what if I designed an entire class out of the GEJ project? What would I do with it? And so I had this sort of crazy idea, and I first landed on a first-year writing seminar called Asia and the Environment. And I took 5 or 6 films and I arranged them into categories of dams, rivers, ethnicities and border regions, animals, and some other things, and just had the students engage in a film a week. And so that was the focus. We used the study guide questions, we used the study guides. They did some additional reading, and they brought news articles into class in relationship to what they were looking at. That course eventually morphed into what is now a sort of a 200 level seminar for the Environmental Justice Studies program and Religious Studies called Asian Environment. And it's a fairly robust syllabus, but that was sort of the plan, was to see what could be done at the level of a course as a whole if it were to engage the collection more broadly. And as I think about this now, and I'm looking at the expansion of the GEJ project, I might push this a little bit more to be even outside of Asia, and to allow for the course to include additional films and whatnot. But the course description sort of deals with the various environmental topics across Asia. Like I said, it has an initial section on dams and hydroelectric power, and all the kinds of the complexities that go into those large-scale environmental engineering projects. It has this section on rivers and the wider use and abuses of rivers, and what can be done to change those situations. There's a unit on mountains, mangroves, and sand, looking at sort of the movement of the uses of those kinds of spaces, the ethnicities and border regions, as I said. And then it closes out with a segment on hope for the future, where we sort of think about, many of the stories that are told in the documentaries are difficult, and you feel very disempowered in many cases after listening to the stories. So where are the points where there have been successes in environmental justice? And we look at the examples of those, and then all of that forms the basis for the students to do a research paper. So this is a course that is hardwired with the GEJ project. In other cases, I've used particular films in particular courses, but this is probably the most expansive effort that I've had with the project.
Nice, thank you. So you mentioned sort of the expansion of GEJ, Jake, and I'm wondering, environmental justice is such a huge topic, and there's so much urgency behind it. I guess, how do you kind of reconcile that with the collection itself? Like, how do you enable students to keep abreast of the ever evolving situation going on with environmental justice? Or am I thinking way beyond the scope of GEJ? Or are there, I guess, plans to kind of keep adding new films, new content to be able to expand the instructional potential of the platform.
Perhaps I could just kick in a word on that.
Sure.
First of all, you can see why I enjoy working with the faculty at Whittier College. It's an inspiring process that fires me up and sends me out looking for more films that can be added. I think one area where we added several films has to do with African American studies and the look at the unequal impact of things like heat domes or pollution from hydroelectric dams and so on. All those become expanded areas. So while we initially had maybe 75% of the films dealt with Asia, I think that's down to about half now, but we've also doubled again the number of films. So there's now currently 48 different films in it, in the collection, where we started out really committed to making 15 or 20. So I think the opportunities for these kinds of collected efforts or shared effort here is really great.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm wondering, Becky and Jake, if if you do any assessment following, the projects related to these films. How are you measuring? Are you measuring outcomes, learning outcomes? If so, can you talk about any of those?
It sounds like Jake has more with your course, Jake, that you have that. I mean, so I'll defer to you. I'll just say that I haven't specifically looked at a film and how it impacts class learning, except like what I just mentioned to you. I realized, this was one of the couple of last times I used it in that one course, that it was, like I said, it really did change the conversation in the course, and it changed the way we talked about all subsequent issues. But no, I wouldn't say that I've been rigorous about measuring specific learning outcomes. But it sounds like Jake, you wanted to.
Yeah, for the most part, that's similar in the cases where I use a film for a specific course. But for the Asian environment, they are required to put their research paper in conversation with at least two of the documentaries over the course of the semester, so that the problem that they're researching, they show how it relates to something that we've done in the class. And that's kind of an internal assessment, but a more systematic rubric or assessment tool, I tend not to do that.
You just heard from Becky Overmeyer Velasquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. This episode is brought to you with support from GEJ. Join us next week as we look at the metrics and engagement behind the GEJ film collection and discuss what those numbers reveal about how the films are being used in instruction. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.